by announcing that I'm thrilled, pumped to be back with my brother, Carlo. I got to say, every time we do shows together, the audience loves them. And the one thing the audience always tells me is they get a lot, they benefit a whole lot from your incredible work, Carlo. Carlo, before we even dive in, I want to pick your brain and ask you, how have you been, brother? How's everything going for you?
Yeah, well, things are going well, William. First of all, let me say thank you for having me on your show, man. It's always a blessing and a blast to chat with you, my friend. You do such great work, and I'm just honored to be on with you. I'm grateful to your viewers and listeners and commenting and saying how they're enjoying the segments when I'm on with you. So there's a lot happening in my life, bro. We recently moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because of a formal partnership that Catholic Answers entered into with the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma, which involves me living here and directing half of my workload as a Catholic Answers apologist to the Diocese of Tulsa. So while I'll continue to do stuff for Catholic Answers on the national platform, writing my books, articles, my podcast, Sunday Catholic Word, which you can get at sundaycatholicword.com, and even the speaking ministry, I'm also devoting Catholic Answers work to on the local level here in the diocese, hopping around from parish to parish, giving talks, missions, etc. I have just in 2 weeks of being in the office, I've booked 25 events throughout the diocese from now until April involving parish missions, RCIA talks, men group talks, youth group talks, staff formation days, teacher orientation days, and a variety of other different formats of presentation. So I'm super excited about this partnership here in the Diocese of Tulsa. Bishop David Conderla has a great team. This team he has at the Chancery is literally top notch, William. And they're doing such great things in evangelistic endeavors. People are converting to the faith here. They're coming to Christ in the fullness of truth and life in the church. People here in the diocese listen to Catholic Answers live. Yeah, it's amazing, right? You go into somewhere and the Catholics actually know about Catholic Answers and the work that we do. And I laugh at that because many times when you go into Catholic parishes and your run-of-the-mill parish, they really don't know about the work we do at Catholic Answers. So it's nice to know that people here are listening. So there's just fertile soil here in the Diocese of Tulsa. Catholic families are actually moving here from other states in the country to join the Catholic community that's being developed here in the diocese. And we're so blessed to be a part of it, especially to have a formal presence of Catholic Answers here in the diocese. So,
well, I have to be very clear and honest. They are incredibly blessed to have you there, brother. That is awesome. And that is an incredible report of praise. That's great. Thank the good Lord, all glory to God. That is magnificent. And now I know why you laughed there, and it's very clear because the regular church pew-going individual, maybe they've heard a Catholic Answers show, and but they don't know the name of the show. They really don't know even some of them don't even know the basic apologetics approaches. So that's going to be, I know for a fact, an incredible blessing for them. And from what I'm hearing from you, it's already blessing a lot of people. And I imagine your presence is as well, because I have to be honest, brother, you are doing incredible work. You have the brand new book out, which I was privileged. I'm going to brag. I got to read the draft of it before it came out. Loved it. And I told you, hey, you got to put this, take it from your brain and put it down to paper and publish this. And I'm thrilled that it's been published. By the time this airs, there will be a link. People can go ahead and find it on the, I believe, shop.catholic.com, but I'll have a direct link. Yeah, but I'll have a direct link there. And the great thing is I know a lot of people love electronic books and then, of course, physical. They can get copies of both. I usually like having both. They'll be down there. There will be editions for them to get. They can look it up. That it really is a book, I think, Carlo, that could not have been written at a better time. Yeah. Let me pick your brain there. Why this book? Why is it relevant for right now, our times?
Well, because right now in our time, we're rubbing shoulders and elbow greasing with others who have adopted the woke mentality, right? Within our woke culture, which in short is sort of this narrative that there are people who are being oppressed by oppressors. those people being non-white people, for example, those people being members who have chosen the lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community. Now, initially, we would be all on board for being against oppression of even these people, right? Especially those who choose the lifestyle choice of LGBTQ plus community. And those sort of lifestyle choices, we would oppose those lifestyle choices, but at the same time, we affirm they should not be oppressed. And by oppression, we mean unjust actions toward them, right? And keeping them from having certain goods that are justly due to them. Within non-white people, we would get on board with saying they should not be oppressed, right? We're against white supremacy when understood like that. But the key question is, within our woke culture, what is meant by oppression?
Yeah.
Many people perceive these groups of people being oppressed in a way that we cannot get on board with. Yeah. And this is what I point out in my book, The New Relativism. One example being within critical race theory that non-white people are oppressed by people who affirm objective truth. Yeah. As it's stated in the literature and in the popular audience, that objectivity, affirming objective truth, is a means by which white people perpetuate their white supremacy. Objectivity is the means by which white people oppress non-white people. So what they're saying is affirming objective truth, William, is a means by which non-white people are being oppressed. Well, as just rightfully thinking human beings, we cannot get on board with that. As lovers of sanity, we cannot get on board with that because we recognize it is insane to say there is no objective truth, because it's contrary to the intellect. It's contrary to reason. There is a logical incoherence involved within that. And so the intellect rightfully rejects that idea that there is no objectivity, that there is no objective truth. So it's absurd to be saying that it is wrong, i.e. white supremacy, to say there is objective truth. How can you say white supremacy is wrong when at the same time you're saying you cannot be objective? There is no objective truth. The bottom line is you need objective truth in order to say white supremacy is wrong. And so this is what we find in our culture. There's these logical incoherencies that are affecting people, right? Because nobody wants to be labeled white supremacist. Right. And so given that initial inclination, they will begin to unsuspectingly adopt the relativistic thinking that's embodied within such woke modern moral commands, one of which being, thou shalt not be a white supremacist. And that's chapter 1 in my book, The New Relativism. So this is one example among many of how relativism is under the guise of these woke moral commands. Thou shalt not be a white supremacist. Thou shalt not say he. Thou shalt not say he when the biological male says, I'm a she. Yeah. Right? Thou shalt not impose your beliefs upon others. Thou shalt not be an intolerant, judgmental, hateful bigot. Thou shalt not misinform. Thou shalt not be anti-science. Yeah. All of these modern moral commands are actually disguising or masking a relativistic thinking that's lurking behind them. And so that's the thesis of the book, is to unmask that relativism, expose it for what it is, in contrast to the common claim that relativism is dead and passé, and we're no longer dealing with relativism because we live in a shame culture, and you can't have relativism when you live in a shame culture. Well, I'm arguing in the book that is false, and that relativism is alive and well, and what's new about it is that it's hidden. Yeah. It's hidden behind the moral absolutes of our contemporary shame culture. But when you unspin the modern spin, when you pull back the veil, when you take off the mask, what you find immediately is some form of relativism, whether it's total relativism, whether it's moral relativism, cultural relativism, it's all there.
Now, Carlo, if somebody were to ask you, what exactly is total relativism? Yeah. Is there a way that we can define that kind of like a kind of in a nutshell for people that may be wondering,
Yeah.
what is relativism? And by the way, for the audience that may be wondering, this is the incredible table of contents. Of course, you're going to have to get a hold of the book to go through everything, but you have it broken down brilliantly in different parts. Part one titled Total Relativism, then Moral Relativism, then Cultural Relativism. Now, what is this? What do we mean by total relativism? And is it important for us today?
Yeah, so relativism, generally speaking, is normally associated with what philosophers call total relativism. And that is to say there is no absolute truth whatsoever. Whether we're talking about morality, religion, history, science, even math, there's no absolute truth. We all have our own distinct, own individual realities that are different realities than another. That's the most extreme form of relativism. And we label it as total because there are more restricted, localized, partial forms of relativism. So, for example, moral relativism, which states there might be some objective truth when it comes to science and math, but when it comes to morality, when it comes to right and wrong human behavior, good and bad human behavior, there is no absolute truth. For moral truth, right and wrong human behavior is relative to the individual's subjective judgments and what he or she thinks is good or bad human behavior. So that's moral relativism. Now, you got these two major forms: total relativism, the more localized, moral relativism. And then that can either be based on or relative to the measuring rod of the individual or the measuring rod of the collection of individuals. And whenever it's the collection of individuals, a group of individuals, a society or a culture, we call that cultural relativism. So some people might say there is no truth whatsoever except relative to the culture or society. But then some might restrict that a little bit more and say, well, there's some absolute truth. But when it comes to moral truth, that's relative to the culture of the society. So societies will have their own distinct moralities as to what is good and bad human behavior, and differing, and they will differ amongst each other. And so that's cultural relativism. And what I did in the book, William, as you pointed out, I divided the book into these three kinds of relativism: total, moral, and cultural. Yeah. And then as I was going through the modern woke moral commands, it became apparent how some of them fit better in each of these different categories. So some commands fit within the total relativism category, some moral commands fit within the moral relativism category, and others fit within the cultural relativism. And so that's the point of the book, is going through these woke moral commands and exposing the type of relativism that's lurking behind them and then refuting them.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. You put that forth brilliantly, Carlo. And I think that more than ever, the time that we're living in right now really is inundated with a kind of wokeism, if you will, kind of culture where, people are woke, and even depending on where you're at and who you dialogue with, a trigger can be, something can be triggered if you merely assume one's gender. Like, for instance, if you look very clearly, if you encounter a male who is, let's be clear and honest about, who's dressed up as a female, and you can very clearly see that it is a male, and you're used to seeing, men, and you address a person as what they clearly were born as biologically. At times we have seen the current cultural climate, it will trigger certain people. They'll go bonkers and say, have you assumed my gender? They'll say, hey, I am not a male, I'm a female. Carlo, I don't remember this being such a huge deal or such a woke kind of marker 10, 15, 20 years back. What's going on, Carlo?
Yeah, well, I think it's the wicked offspring of some of the philosophical problems that have their roots in contraception, the philosophical problems in the abortion issues. And it's this philosophical assumption of a particular view of the human being where the true self, the true I, is merely the rational self. Descartes calls that the res cogitans, right? The thinking self is the true self, and that the body is that which is not the true self and is entirely divorced from the true self. It's a form of angelism. It's this false philosophical view of the human person that we're mere ghosts and machines. We're angels that happen to be possessing a body. And so the body can come and go, it can do whatever you want with it. It's, as one philosopher put it, Peter Pan's playground, right?
Yeah.
Where there's no rules to the body, and the body has no bearing on our individuality and our identity as a member of the human species. And so therefore it is concluded, I can change the visible appearance of it. I can change the quote unquote sex, however they're going to define that, which is problematic in and of itself, according to how my, what is called gender identity, the inner sense or feeling of being male or female, right? And so that's the philosophical assumption. But that philosophical assumption was and is driving the whole debate about same-sex sexual activity and so-called marriage among members of the same sex. It's the same philosophical assumption. The body is divorced from the rational self, and so we can utilize our sexual powers, which are of the body, in whatever way we so desire or choose, and we determine as good. And so from that philosophical assumption comes the logical consequence, the wicked offspring of the contemporary gender ideology, where the body does not have any bearing on my personal individuality. So it is subject entirely to my will as I see fit, or as I think it is fitting, given my quote unquote gender identity, inner sense or feeling of being a man or a woman. Yeah.
By the way, for the audience wondering, we're talking about your new incredible book, The New Relativism. And I recommend everybody get a copy of it. In fact, I would recommend that they get multiple, to give them away, give them out to family members as well. I think that will really open up their eyes. You know, here's another thing, Carlo. You know, I mean, these transgender individuals or the LGBTQT community, they're not bothering you, Carlo. You know, why are you being intolerant? You know, they're not doing anything to you. You know, why do we have to be intolerant bigots is what, you know, we hear that very often. You know, thou shalt not be intolerant is a section of this book, brilliantly written. You know, what do you do when they, because I'm sure you've heard that 1,000 times, when they say, hey, come on, Carlo, you know, you do your thing. You know, they're not bothering you, Carlo. Let them use the restroom they want to use. They're not bothering you. They're not going to, you know, they're not going to infringe upon your rights. To that, Carlo, you know, how do we reply to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, notice the assumption is that they're not bothering me or other people, and they're not infringing upon my rights or other people's rights. But in actuality, these lifestyle choices do have effects. There's no such thing as this individualized, personal, autonomous morality. Things that we do and behavior patterns that we develop overflow and affect other people. And we're experiencing this today. I mean, you cannot keep your job today in certain institutions unless you conform to what somebody thinks they are. So if a biological male says, I am she, and you must call me as such, you must affirm my judgment that I am a female despite my biological maleness, then you will be fired if you do not conform. I mean, so it does affect people. But besides all of that, William, you brought up this idea of the charge that we should not be intolerant, that we must tolerate these lifestyle choices. But of course, that raises the question, well, what do you mean by tolerance? Getting back to what we talked about before, what do you mean by white supremacy? What do you mean by intolerance? The flip side being, what do you mean by tolerance? Well, what they mean by tolerance within contemporary culture is we must accept and celebrate all lifestyle choices as equal and valid. That's what they're demanding of us. But William, if all lifestyle choices are equal and valid, well, then no lifestyle choice can be right and another wrong, which is just the essence of what? Moral relativism, right? Within the mental framework of moral relativism, no human behavior can be right and no human behavior can be wrong. And in absolute sense, they can only be different, but equal and valid. That is exactly the philosophical thinking that's behind the common charge of you shouldn't be intolerant, you should be tolerant. But if that's the case, William, we can't get on board with that, because there are some human behaviors, some lifestyle choices that are contrary to our good as human beings and are wrong, not good for us as human beings, in an absolute way, independent of what you or I happen to think or whatever time and culture you belong to and exist in. And here's one classic example, right? We just go back to the critical race theory thing.
Yeah.
So think about this, William. If all lifestyle choices are equal and valid, and that's what they mean by tolerance, and we got to accept it, well, why not? Why? Well, I guess we need to accept the lifestyle choice of being a white supremacist.
Right.
But of course, we cannot do that, right?
Right.
Because the whole critical race theory building edifice would come crumbling down. So apparently, not all lifestyle choices are equal and valid. There are some lifestyle choices that we cannot tolerate in the sense of approving and celebrating. Now, there's a different question about tolerating certain behaviors within civil society relative to the government and authority and policing.
Yeah.
But when it comes, if the question is, should we celebrate a lifestyle choice and approve it? Well, the answer is surely no, because racism is something we should not celebrate and approve. Yeah. So there are some lifestyle choices that we cannot tolerate in the sense of celebrate and approve and say are equal and valid.
Now, Carlo, you are a guy a lot like me. You like to pump iron. You like to lift weights. I love to lift weights as well. I've been doing it for many years. I know you have as well. And the one thing that I think of at times, Carlo, is people will then say, well, look, they're not bothering you, people that want to identify as a female. But, to use a very silly example, if one day you or myself were to decide to identify as a female and then go and try and compete in a weightlifting contest against women, it's very likely we would, smoke them in that competition. It would not be fair at all.
Right.
So with that in mind, the idea that there is no harm being done, there is harm being done, because if you look in the news, you'll find that people, biological males are breaking all kinds of records. Yes. And look, let's be very clear, Carlo. I got a little girl. They're shattering little girls' dreams of winning competitions that they spend their whole lives competing and trying to get to a certain level. And it really isn't fair. And it's not to say that men are, we're superior to women. No, but we have a different physical structure. Sure. Very, very different. So it really is simply to think that this is not affecting other people. I think that is problematic. The idea that wokeism is not affecting society, that's problematic. Try policing what your child watches today. That's quite the tough thing to do in and of itself. So, when they tell us, hey, thou shalt not say he or she, they're not bothering you. You're intolerant. It is causing issues in society, and these are irreversible issues. When you destroy certain records and you destroy people's dreams, we shouldn't let it get to that point. Carlo, before we move to another topic, let me ask your opinion. What do you think can be done?
Well, it needs to stop, right? Yeah. So the powers that be need to have policies in place to where biological males, we would just say a man, should not be competing in women's sports, because there is an injustice that's being perpetrated there towards the women. It is undermining the women from the equal opportunity of achieving the good of the reward within that particular sport. The man participating in that sport is not proportioned to that reward. It is the female's body and strength and physiology that is the proportionate cause of those goods, right? That's where you have to have equal opportunity within the competition, so that there's a proportion between the reward or the good that's being given due to the cause and the cause that's bringing it about, right? So that's how we would analyze that philosophically. So it's just the bottom line. It's just got to stop. It's got to stop in the same way that we would not allow an adult to go and play in a 6-year-old soccer match or football match. I mean, like, for example, my 12-year-old son, Elijah, he's starting football here in Tulsa, and it's a tackle football league, right? Well, it would be unjust for us as dads to go and play the game, put on pads and helmet, and go and knock around these 12-year-olds. And then there's elementary kids who are playing tackle football. No sane person would allow these adults to go and play football against these younger kids. But the logic that would justify, say, Thomas, right? Leah Thomas, quote unquote, Leah Thomas, and that's the name he goes by, competing in women's swimming meets. That logic is the same logic that would justify us adults going and playing tackle football against the third graders in the Noah Jaguars League here in Tulsa. But rightfully so, policies are in place to stop that behavior, because that is an injustice. Not to mention the harm that it's going to cause, right? Yeah. And so too, policies have to be in place to stop biological males from competing in women's sports and continuing to perpetrate the injustice toward women. It is an outright affront and attack against women, and women should be enraged by it.
Carlo, if there is one book that I'd recommend people get in the in the month of August, and gift as many copies as they can to people, it is your book, written at a perfect time, The New Relativism. For the audience tuning in case you barely turned the show on, rewind, hear all of it over again, and get a copy of this incredible book. It is incredibly relevant for the times that we are living in. You bring up a lot of very good points there, Carlo, but I think the one point that you are massively forgetting is, hey, man, the Bible says don't judge. What are you doing, Carlo? The Bible says don't judge. Christ wouldn't have judged. Why are you judging these people? If as a Christian, you've got to have a tender heart and you got to be accepting. Why on earth are we judging? Now, isn't that kind of an approach that comes from the woke culture? Isn't that a bit of a problematic approach that they come to the table with to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we always ask that question, what do you mean by judge? You just informed me that I should not judge. Well, what do you mean by judge? Do you mean that I should not judge human behavior as right or wrong? Because if that's what you mean, William, well, then you just judged my behavior for judging other people. Yep. So either you're special pleading and going by a double standard to where I can't judge human behavior, but you can, and that's a bit arbitrary. Why do you get that privilege and I don't? Or you're just going to refute your own argument, right? By doing the very thing you're saying we, generally, you and I, ought not to do. So if that's the case, stop making a judgment on my human behavior, right? Yeah. So that would be my initial response, is to point out that inconsistency there. But then go forward and say, well, hey, look, if we're going to go with this meaning of judging human behaviors, there are some human behaviors, William, that you probably judge are not very good for us as human beings. Again, racism, white supremacy, that's not good human behavior, right? Right. Well, that's a judgment that behavior is bad. So surely you don't mean judgment in the sense of we shouldn't judge human behavior. Yeah. So that would be my first strategy, to try to get the person to understand we're not talking about judging human behavior. That's something we all do, right? Yeah. And that's something that we're doing as Christians when we're saying, hey, that lifestyle choice, that's not good for us as a human being. Just like you would say racism is not good for us as human beings, okay? So we're on the same playing field here. Now, if by judge you mean judging one's culpability, judging one's motives, judging, the person in the quality of their character for the decision that they're making, well, then we can have a conversation, because we're going to agree with you. Especially for us as Christians, we recognize ordinarily speaking, only God has access to the inner movements of the heart and the mind. And within ordinary situations, we ought to be refraining from judging one's culpability, right? We don't know what's going on in the heart and the mind of the individual. Furthermore, as I point out in the book, William, I think it's important to help people understand that we agree that we ought not to think somebody is a wicked, evil, yucky person simply because they're engaging in certain lifestyle choices that we judge to be immoral. And I think this is what happens often. It often manifests itself when people say, like Don Lemon, once on The View, and I point this out in the book, Lemon or Lemon, however you want to pronounce his last name, I've heard it different ways, comes on and says, to Christians and Catholics in particular, listen, why don't you break bread with people? And the assumption being like me, who's living the gay lifestyle, why don't you have a barbecue with us? The implication is that if we have a barbecue with them, we'll see that they're nice people. Yeah. And if they're nice people, we'll come to accept their behavior. Well, guess what, William? We don't say their lifestyle choices are immoral because we think they're non-nice people, right? We recognize that people can be nice and even kind and still engage in immoral behavior. Oh, yeah. We have other reasons why we think the behavior is immoral. It's not because we think they're yucky, mean, bad people, nor do we even think that they're engaging in these lifestyle choices simply to satisfy their cravings for lust. Yeah. Right. And that's something that's assumed by opposing sides for us as Christians. And we have to help people understand, listen, I recognize that someone who's engaging in a lifestyle choice of homosexuality, say, is seeking love and companionship and emotional satisfaction in a friendship, in a romantic friendship. And it might very well not be lust. Yeah. But that still doesn't mean the lifestyle choice is good or moral. You might have good intentions, but the activity itself is what we're after here. The behavior is what we're after here. And if we can get people to realize that, then we can dispel this notion that we're being judgmental. I'm not being judgmental because I recognize, hey, you're probably a nice, kind, loving person, right? I don't think you're yucky and and evil and a lust seeker. The reason why I make the judgment that the lifestyle choice is immoral is because, for various reasons, it's contrary to our nature as human beings and therefore not good for us. And if not good for us, then it's not going to lead to authentic human happiness. But of course, that requires a longer conversation to flesh all that stuff out. But at least you can sketch for somebody what we're after here and what we're not after.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point there, because really, even biblically, we are called to judge in the sense of discerning whether or not something is right or morally right or wrong. Now, of course, the one that's going to judge our souls at the end of time is at the end of our lives is God Almighty. We recognize that, of course, but we are able to judge in the sense of discerning what's right or wrong, and they do that as well. They are judging as well whether or not they believe something to be morally right or morally wrong. And we're telling them that we believe that lifestyle is a morally bankrupt one. Right. And I think that the woke culture that we're living in today, where they also every now and then, actually probably 99% of the time that you see Pope Francis' words in the news, they're usually almost always ripped out of context, where Pope Francis will say, and he rightly so says, God loves even those that are homosexual, those living disordered lifestyles. The key thing is we agree with that, but it doesn't mean that the Lord is happy with that sinful union. Right. So I think that's an important distinction, isn't it?
Yeah, because love is to will the good of the other. Yeah. And if I'm loving you, even though you're engaging in the lifestyle behavior, what that involves is I want what is good for you, which means stop the immoral lifestyle behavior and start living consistent with what is good for you. So that's what true love is. Think about this, William. To actually accept, celebrate, and approve a human behavior that's immoral is the very antithesis of love. Yeah. Love is to will what is good for the other. But if I'm willing what is not good for the other, that is contrary to love. That's actually hate.
Yeah.
So in response to the common charge that we're being hateful for disapproving of certain lifestyle choices associated with the LGBTQ plus community, it's actually they're doing the very thing that we're not doing, right? They're
Mhm.
claiming we're doing the very thing they're doing, right? Because
Right.
they're willing what is not good, we're willing what is good,
Mhm.
given our nature as human beings. Now, of course, that raises the question: how do we determine what is good, right? And that whole philosophical discussion. But from the natural law perspective, it's our human nature that's going to determine what's good and bad for us. So good
Yeah.
human action is going to be an act that's consistent with what our nature determines is good for us.
Oh
And
yeah.
bad human act is going to be an act that is not consistent with what our nature determines is good for us. And
Yeah.
so that's the standard that applies to all of us insofar as we are human beings. And that's the objective moral reality that we're coming from, as opposed to a moral relativism, which says moral truth is relative to the individual's subjective judgment.
Yeah, great way you laid that out. Another thing that I'm just fascinated by in your book, one of the first things that I do being a geek, I always go to the end notes. And you've got a ton of end notes as well, where you point the audience to other stuff that they can look up and do more research on. I have seldom encountered an author who's able to pack so much information in a little bit under 200 pages. But you are able to do it in your incredible book, The New Relativism, Carlo. And I want to recommend everybody get a copy. I have read it more than once. I've shared multiple copies with friends and family because, you never know what friend or family member is in dialogue with somebody that might need to hear, that may be aware of what is going on, but they may think, well, you know what, it really isn't that important. But it really, truly is a vital aspect of our everyday lives. It is very important to be aware of these battleground arguments, if you will, that come from the woke side. There is one particular area, and it's a great area. It's under your part 3, under cultural relativism, where number 9, you title it, "Thou shalt not misinform." Now,
Yeah.
what is going on there? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I directed the chapter at the whole COVID-19 issue, right? Because this is where the misinformation command, "thou shalt not misinform," came to the fore with regard to COVID-19 issues. So what was, as we all know, you had a stock narrative that was created, constructed, and perpetrated by those powers that be. And any sort of critical analysis of that narrative concerning COVID-19 and the remedies and the treatment of COVID-19 was labeled as misinformation and silenced. And so
Yeah.
there was this push for modern censorship of simply offering critical analysis of that narrative. Now, as I argue in my book, there's a flavor or a taste of relativism there, because what's going on here, William, and what was going on and still is to this day, is that persuasion of the mind was taken off of the table. There
Yeah.
was no room for a rational discussion of weighing the arguments for and against these opposing views. But the powers that be, who had control of the media and other outlets, totally excluded the voice of opposition and taking persuasion of the mind off of the table. Now, the reason why I say that's a flavor of relativism, because in the mental framework of relativism, within that philosophical worldview, William, there is no room for persuasion of the mind. Because in relativism, there is no objective reality for your mind and my mind to conform to. There is only my own reality and your own reality. And so persuasion of the mind is not an option. There is only a conflict of wills there whenever we have opposing, quote unquote, realities within the mental framework of relativism. And that is exactly what was concretized, right?
Right.
Within the COVID-19 issues, is that persuasion of the mind was taken off of the table. Now, either persuasion of the mind is taken off the table because they don't believe that there is any truth for us to come to know, and it is only power that reigns, And that's a possibility because there are some powers that be who would speak like that, right?
Right.
Especially within critical race theory and the popular voices of critical race theory saying that persuasion of the mind is not an option. It's only power that's going to bring about change. Ex Ibram Kendi is
Right.
one who has written on that and stated that as such. So I'm not closing the door on that option, right? The other option is that, well, we have to censor these opposing views because the majority of people in the popular audience aren't trained enough in order to sift through these different views about COVID-19 issues. And so we have to censor this opposition. But in response to that, William, we're talking about issues we're talking about opposing views by credible scientists, right? Credible doctors, medical doctors who have just as much credibility as those, as in the words of Anthony Fauci, who have an air of authority. And so for us as people who, yes, we're not trained in the medical literature and being able to make those judgments, but we can rightfully and reasonably look to differing scientific authorities and to listen. It's not like we're 5-year-olds. We are individuals who have an intellect and who are trained to use them in some degree or fashion, who can listen to these authorities to see what kind of information they're giving us in critiquing the other person's side. And so there's a need to respect us as adults to be able to look to differing authorities on these issues who have legitimate credibility in order to make an informed decision, especially about things that we're going to be that are dealing with our very well-being and our health and us personally, right? And so we need to be able to make those informed decisions. So that's all I'm pointing out in my book, is that there was an air or flavor of relativism within this modern censorship under the command of thou shalt not misinform.
Yeah. Great way that you broke that down, Carlo. Really, really good way. You brought up briefly science. And that is a very important area where you actually do hear very often the claims on the other side from the woke culture that, look, get with the times. Not only Catholics, but any Christian, any believer in God really needs to get with the times. We're told that we are anti-science, that we're the ones that are anti-science, yet when you compare everything and you look at the data, you look at the information, it couldn't be further from the truth. As believers in faith believers, we are not anti-science at all. But you have a great section, and I want to make one other point before we dive into that. That is your under part 3, section 10. But I want to let the audience know we've covered a few things today. You have so much jam-packed in this book that we're barely able to touch upon a little bit. I want to recommend they get a hold of your very good book, The New Relativism, here, because there are many sections we didn't cover. We have not covered. They've got to get a hold of the book. I recommend they get a copy. But you do have here where you cover, thou shalt not be anti-science. What does that mean? And what exactly... Can you give us a little bit of a flavor of what you cover there?
Yeah, so this deals with COVID-19 issues as well, and it's very much related to the previous one, thou shalt not misinform. The modern command of you shouldn't be anti-science, when you unspin that modern spin, what you discover is that it was a labeling of the opposing view. Anybody who opposed the narrative constructed by, again, in the words of Fauci, those who have an air of authority, they were labeled as anti-science, not following the science. But in reality, what these people were doing was looking to other scientists who were arriving at different conclusions and not following the established narrative by those who have an air of authority. Right. So rather than them being anti-science, they were just following different scientists and not the particular group of scientists that Dr. Fauci and others were saying was the representation of the truth concerning these matters. So whenever somebody follows a different conclusion of another scientist, they're not being anti-science. They're actually being scientific, because in scientific inquiry, you're going to have a weighing of the different hypotheses, right?
Oh, yeah.
According to the evidence, there's going to be a back and forth. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be opposition based upon the data, people reading the data in different ways. And so you have to expect that disagreement and opposition within scientific inquiry. And so for someone simply to disagree with the established narrative concerning these matters by those in authority is not to be anti-science. It's just simply not to go along with that group of scientists.
Yeah.
And so what manifests there is a form of cultural relativism. These who have, in the words of Fauci, an air of authority, saying the truth about these matters is relative to this particular group of scientists.
Yeah.
And not any other group. And if you follow any other group, then you're the bad guy. You're being anti-science, right? And so and this is what's happening in woke culture. If you do not follow the established norm by the powers that be, then you are the bad guy, no matter what you say. That's a form of cultural relativism, that the truth of these things is going to be relative only to the particular group of those who are in power and are constructing these narratives about what is the truth of these things. And then this particular issue would be COVID-19 issues.
Yeah. Which was a very massive dividing line. And we know that not only does the woke culture look down upon people that go against their mindset, but they outright have been known to cancel people or attempt to cancel people that go against their ideologies. And we are living in a time where more than ever, we need to learn about moral relativism, learn about everything that you highlight in your incredible book, The New Relativism. Now, Carlo, before we wrap up, I do want to ask you one thing, one very important question. If there would be one, and I know there's probably more than just one, if there would be one major message that you would want your audience to take from this book, or even multiple incredible points, what would they be?
To be a lover of sanity, that we have to engage the fight on the intellectual front.
Yeah.
But that requires equipping our own intellect and forming our own mind to be able to engage in that battle. Because from the Christian perspective, William, we know that the evil one knows how God has made us as human beings, with the intellect in the driver's seat. That's how God made us. The intellect is the rudder for the ship. It's the governor of the wheel. The intellect is that which presents to the will what it sees to be good. So if the evil one can capture the mind of the individual, he can capture the will and lead the will astray, because that's how God made us. And so it's important for us to know that, William, so that we can roll up our sleeves, get down and dirty, enter into the fray on the intellectual front to begin at least to recapturing the mind of the modern man and to reclaim sanity. And so as lovers of sanity, we want to sift through the intellectual confusion of modern woke culture. Why? For the sake of capturing the mind, for the sake of sanity, which is conformity to reality, i.e. truth. Why? For the sake of leading the will to conform itself to truth, love truth, seek truth, and rest in truth. And as a Christian, we know that seeking and that resting is ultimately in the truth, the person of Jesus Christ.
Where can people find out more information about Carlo? And Carlo, I know you are incredibly busy, but if anybody were to want to invite you to their parish to give a talk, are they able to? And where can people find what you're working on? And are you working on anything new, any new book for the future?
Yeah, so they can, in order to bring me out to speak, they can go to CatholicAnswersSpeakers.com, fill out the inquiry form there, or just call Catholic Answers and say, hey, we'd like to book Carlo. What do we got to do? They'll put you in contact with our seminar coordinator, Jennifer Phelps, and she'll walk you through the process of getting me out to speak at your parish or whatever you want me to speak at. So that's CatholicAnswersSpeakers.com. Okay. They can follow my work at Catholic.com, the articles I publish, Catholic Answers Live, and my podcasts. There at Catholic.com. For my podcast, they can simply go to SundayCatholicWord.com. And that's a podcast where I look at the upcoming Sunday Mass readings, but I highlight specifically the details that are relevant for doing apologetics. Okay. And that's what makes my Sunday liturgy of the word prep kind of thing different than Dr. Hahn and Dr. Bergsma and all of these other biblical scholars, or I should say biblical scholars, because I wouldn't classify myself as a biblical scholar. So not other, but biblical scholars and their podcast. So we have a Catholic Answers flavor to it, where we're highlighting those apologetical details. So that's SundayCatholicWord.com. I also have my own website, KarloBroussard.com, but it's just hosting everything I do at Catholic Answers in one location. Now, with regard to the question of what am I working on, I'm actually writing a book right now on the saints, to where I'm going to be defending the intercession of the saints, the veneration of the saints, i.e. honoring of the saints, the veneration of icons and relics, and all of that stuff that's wrapped up into the Catholic understanding of the communion of saints. So I'm working on that book project right now. The hope is to release that in the fall of 2024 if everything goes according to plan. So so the podcast, my book, the speaking ministry, the work that I'm doing here in the Diocese of Tulsa, it's quite a load, but by God's grace, hopefully I can keep lifting it.
Carlo, I want to thank you very much for your time today. Want to again remind the audience, the great book we talked about today was your book, The New Relativism. There'll be a link right down below.
Shop.Catholic.com. Yeah,
shop.Catholic.com. We want to recommend, look, we know that you can find these books on Amazon and other places, but we want to support our really good Catholic businesses. They're really small, and they, you know what? They're helping out our incredible apologists and speakers. We want to help them out. Go to shop.Catholic.com. There will be a link down there. And Carlo, thank you very much for your time, brother. I look forward to having you back on again soon, brother.
Hey, William, thanks for having me, bro. God bless, man.
God bless you, brother. I'll talk to you soon.